Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Author Alliance Book Month panel in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. Today's panel is going to be all about world building with cultural elements in middle grade. And before we get started, I am going to give all of our lovely panelists today the opportunity to introduce themselves. So Maisie, do you want to start us off with introductions?
Hi, I'm Maisie Chan. I'm a British-born Chinese children's author based in Glasgow. I'm the author of Danny Chung Sums It Up, which is out with Abrams. But in the UK, it's called Danny Chung Does Not Do Maths, which is a little bit confusing for some people. And it's about Danny, who's 11, who gets a surprise, which is his Chinese grandma, and she moves into his bedroom. And it's about their relationship over the course of a few months.
And Malia?
Hi, I'm Malia Mauna Kea. I am a descendant of Kanak Maoli, and I live in Colorado. My debut is coming out next summer. It's a contemporary fantasy called Lei and the Fire Goddess. It'll be coming out with Penguin. It's a Hawaiian mythology book, kind of like Percy Jackson-esque, where a girl doesn't listen to her grandma, defies a goddess, and has to rescue her best friend before everything is covered in lava.
And Christina?
Hi, I'm Christina Matula. I am Canadian, mixed Taiwanese-Hungarian descent, and I am the author of The Not So Uniform Life of Holly May, which is about a 12-year-old girl from Toronto who loves field hockey and bubble tea and rules. And her world turns upside down when her mom gets a promotion and they have to move to Hong Kong. And there she has to navigate a new world of private school, frenemies, and expectations without the loving guidance of her Taiwanese grandmother, Ama. And I wanted to say thank you to Rebecca, who is my acquiring editor. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. I love Holly May so much. And finally, Sylvia.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Liu, and I write both picture books and middle grade. My most recent middle grade is one coming out in 1 month. It's called Hannah Shu and the Ghost Crab Nation. And it's a sci-fi set in the near future where teens get their brains connected to the internet when they turn 13. And my character, all she wants to do is join the craze because she thinks that'll get her closer to her parents. I mean, her mother and her sister. But she finds a corporate conspiracy that threatens herself and her classmates. And so she has to figure out how to save them all.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I love that cover. And I am Rebeccacuss, and I am a senior editor at Rick Riordan Presents and Disney Hyperion. I'm so excited to be here today with all of you to talk about world building at middle grade, some of my favorite things. So to kick it all off, I'm really curious. You all come from such interesting and varied backgrounds, and I would really love to know kind of how have your life experiences influenced your middle grade worlds and these settings that you create for your characters. Malia, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So I am from Hawaii, and my earliest memories are growing up in our small house in Volcano in the middle of the rainforest, which is the setting for my book Lei. I've lived on the continent for a long time now, but where you're from really sticks with you and kind of influences who you've become, and all of your morals and your values and your codes are kind of what you've brought with you along the way, or at least they are for me. So all of the stuff that you're taught as a kid, like listening to your kupuna and giving Honi kiss on the cheek when you meet people and taking off your slippers before you go in the house. Or in my parents' case, they made us all wash our feet with the hose outside because we never wore slippers and we're just running around barefoot all the time. My parents were the strict ones. And also for me, it's taken a whole lot longer to figure out the family tree because everybody there is your auntie and your uncle, and even your parents' co-workers are auntie and uncle because that's just how you address everyone. So piecing together who your actual auntie and uncle are can be confusing at the family picnics and luau's and stuff. So going and taking that into middle grade is really fun to be able to go back and remember all the cultural stuff I was raised with.
I love what you say about kind of how your stories are so much about what you learned as a child, and that part of your childhood never leaves you, because I find that to be so true. Really, children's books are how we pass on lessons to the next generation. And I see that so much in middle grade. Anyone else? Sylvia, how about you?
Sure. Yeah, I actually was born in the United States, but I moved to Caracas, Venezuela, South America, when I was 5, and stayed there through high school until I came back to the US for college. So I went to an American and international school where people came from all over the world. So I was very used to a very multicultural upbringing, but at home, with Chinese culture. So a lot of my stories, like, first of all, my casts of characters in my middle grade are always completely, diverse. I don't have a homogeneous, cast of characters. And then little things like in my book, Hannah Shue, it's set 30 years in the future. So I have a grandmother character who was born in the 70s. And so it was kind of fun to, or actually kind of late 70s, early 80s. So it was fun to sort of like talk about her experiences growing up, in a more monocultural environment where she suffered from some, like Asian discrimination. But in my near future, it's a very Chinese oriented and influenced world. So then the main character, sees that difference. And then I also, for example, threw in the fact that this grandmother character loved, telenovelas from, like South America, because that was sort of my influence. So anyway, those are just like fun tidbits. And another thing, when Malia mentioned, taking off the shoes, I have a scene early on where my character, is like rushing into the house, coming from, like basically a chase scene, but she still has time to like put her shoes, into the pile of shoes at the doorway, before she goes into the house.
Christina? Oh, Maisie, yes, go.
I just unmuted. I'm British born Chinese, but I was adopted by a white working class English family. And so I think in my middle grade, it feels like the main characters are a little bit like me. They're kind of exploring what they think British Chinese culture is. And I think it's me as the writer also putting into my books what I've learned about British Chinese culture, is that putting your shoes by the door and taking them off, and how you position your chopsticks on the bowl and things like that. Because I didn't grow up with that kind of cultural, those cultural traits, but I've learned them along the way. And so I kind of want to put those into the book to make me feel more Chinese, I guess. Because I think when I was a child, because I was adopted and had white parents, I didn't feel Chinese, even though other people saw me as Chinese. And as I've grown older, I think my middle grade is now an assertion that I'm British Chinese, and here I am, and I'm proud of it, which I wasn't always like that as a child. And so Danny, he can't communicate with his grandma because he mainly speaks English, and his grandma's from a little village in China, so they don't even have the same dialect. And I met my Chinese grandmother I found my birth parents, my birth father, and I had this whole Chinese family that I got to know, and I stayed with my Chinese grandma, and she couldn't speak English that well. So the Nai character was a little bit like her. She was very cuddly and sweet, but we would point at things because we couldn't, communicate fully. So I wanted to put that into the book as well. So I've used a little bit of my experience growing up as a British Chinese person, but not fully knowing the culture, and then trying to find more about the culture as I've grown up, and then putting that into my books.
That's super fascinating. When I grew up in Canada, so mixed Taiwanese. Both my parents are immigrants. My mom is from Taiwan, and my dad's Hungarian, and he was an only child. So when he came after the revolution in Hungary, so he was like 21, and he came all by himself. And my mom came in under different circumstances. She has 9 siblings, and they all came as grad students. Not all of them, but most of them came to Canada and the US as grad students in the 60s, probably like your parents, Sylvia. And And so I think for him, having a family, because he came by himself, like a huge family, extended family, was very comforting for him. And so when I grew up, the Taiwanese side of my family was super, super big, and we had like family reunions with all the cousins, and it was fantastic. I didn't actually realize that wasn't like a normal thing, that people didn't do that with all their families. And I think the cousins are quite tight. But that said, outside of the family, I was very, like, growing up in suburban Ottawa, it was quite, like, all my classmates were white, all my friends were white. And like, I love being mixed race, but that was something at home, and I never did anything with it outside. I didn't want to go to Chinese school. I wasn't interested in learning the language and everything until I got older. And then I moved to Hong Kong, and I was like, wow, and I want to learn more. And so it was only actually, that was a trigger for me, moving to Hong Kong and sort of discovering this world and this, like, deep diving into my culture. And that's sort of a thread of Hong Kong, even though I'm not Hong Kongese, but Chinese culture, similar, and unique in each place, but there are a lot of similarities in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And so it was only when I moved there that I did a deep dive. And so there's a thread of Hong Kong in everything I write.
Thank you all for those incredible answers and for kind of sharing with everyone in the audience just a little bit about you and how your stories have now influenced the stories that you're writing. I'm curious, kind of, we've talked now a little bit about where your influence for these stories come from, but what is your kind of favorite thing about being able to explore these worlds in your writing, whether you're writing from a more contemporary place or whether you're creating more fantastical or sci-fi worlds? What do you love best about the opportunity of world building in middle grade? Sylvia, do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess the first thing that came to mind when you said that is I'd love the opportunity to just share, parts of my culture in the context of a fun story. So I actually wrote, a contemporary story, Mantee's Best Friend, and this sci-fi. And I've noticed in both of those, I have these like key like food scenes where the family's just sitting around eating or making Chinese food. And so that's something that, I think it's the whole idea of, mirrors and windows. So I hope that people who, are Chinese American can see these little scenes and say, oh yeah, I also, eat, shifan for breakfast. Or the people who are not from the culture can get a sense of, oh, this is interesting,
Maisie, do you have any favorite things about world building?
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter which is about Danny and his family going to dim sum, and I wish actually that I'd put more description of the food in, because the whole chapter is more about the relationships between kind of this other family where there's there's kind of a little bit of conflict, because there's a tiger mom and she kind of compares her daughter to Danny, and sometimes she puts him down a little bit. But I kind of wish that I had put more description of the food, because I love dim sum. And growing up, we would go, because my British parents would foster Chinese children. So often the families of those children would take us for dim sum. And I think that going for dim sum was my first sort of realization that I was Chinese, because I loved it so much. It was like, yeah, this is the food of my ancestors, and it's from Hong Kong, and that's where my ancestors are from. And I wanted to put that in a book. So I think, like Sylvia, having those things like dim sum and pot stickers. And when I was in Hong Kong, I saw someone cleaning their chopsticks with the tea, that like from the teapot. So I wanted to put that in as well. And Danny Chung is set in Birmingham, which is my hometown, and it's the second city in the UK, but a lot of people don't think it's as famous as like London or Manchester, even though it's the second city. So I don't live there anymore. So it's kind of a homage to that city and where I grew up. And I think having a kind of unusual identity, even though like Birmingham is very multicultural, it's still, I didn't feel like I was a proper Chinese person there, because I couldn't speak Cantonese and I didn't go to Chinatown, but it's still kind of a place that's deep in my heart. So the book is kind of a homage to where I grew up. Yeah, that's nice.
Malia?
The favorite part for me was being able to get back into mythology. I grew up loving mythology, and I remember very vividly in 3rd grade, there was this illustrated big Greek myths book, and the image of Hades was just so incredible that I was totally in love with those stories. But I also grew up with all of the Hawaiian legends and Moolelo and everything. So when I was thinking about getting into writing, I asked the local librarian, and this is ridiculous because I obviously wasn't reading a whole lot of MG at the time, so excuse my ignorance, but I was like, hey, so I really like Greek mythology books like Percy Jackson, but has anybody ever done anything from a different part of the world? And she was like, yeah, there's like Arusha, and there is like all these others, and we just came out with Dragon Pearl, and she just listed and listed. I was like, what? Is there anything Hawaiian? And she said, no. I was like, okay, here we go. We can do this. There's a need, there's a place for it. People are reading other mythologies. So my favorite thing was really getting to dive back into the stories, and how, kind of like Maisie and Christina had mentioned, getting to know your culture a little bit more and finding out a little bit about who you are has been awesome. And being able to put in all the Hawaiian names and not holding back on those pieces, knowing full well I couldn't pronounce half the Greek names. So it's like, we'll just see and people will figure it out.
It's pretty much a running joke at RRP that none of us can actually say any of those Greek names except for Rick, who is an expert at all of them. And thank you for the shout out of those RRP titles. Dragon Pearl is very near and dear to my heart. It's one of my favorites. Yeah, Christina, what about you? Your favorite things?
This book for me is my love letter to Hong Kong. It just, for me, it was just a magical time. It was a place that we went for work. We were supposed to be there 9 months, and we ended up being there 14 years because we just didn't want to leave. And I started a new phase of my life. I started there as a mom. So I had a newborn when we got there. And so I wasn't only just seeing it through my eyes, but also, doing all the kiddie things, because I was at home with her for a while. And so it was through a child's eyes, and just discovery of everything, and everything that I didn't know Hong Kong was, how it was such, culturally rich, but not just concrete. There was like beautiful country parks and mountains and beaches and all these things I wanted to share, and the food. Like, there's so much food to discover. I thought I knew all Chinese food, but I didn't, and it was amazing. And one of the very favorite things I love is in the book, she goes around Hong Kong, and so every place she's been to is somewhere that means something to me. So she lives at Repulse Bay, and that's where I used to go to the beach or go swimming. And Dragon's Back, where she goes hiking, is one of my favorite trails, and City Hall for dim sum, where I would love going. So these are all places that mean something to me and my family, and I was so happy to be able to share them with readers.
I feel like Sylvia and Maisie and Christina, you all talked about food. And so this is a great time, I think, to pivot to food, because it's one of my favorite things to talk about, because food is great. I love food descriptions and stories. They just win me over, both as a reader and an editor. And I feel like for a lot of diaspora kids and people who are living in diaspora, food, and for me also, especially when I was growing up, food was so much of how I formed a connection with my mother's culture. And I feel like that's true for so many of us. And so I'm so curious, kind of talk to me about food in your world building. Like, how big a part does it play? And what do you kind of use food for in your story? And what does it bring to these worlds that you've written about? Yeah, Christina, do you want to start us off with food?
Sure. So yeah, there's a lot of food in the book, and I want to say, actually, before I start with that, but I remember someone had read my book. It was an American woman, or probably, woman, like university student, who was not Asian, was white, and she read it, and there was a scene in the book where they're talking about Peking duck coming out, and if you've ever had Peking duck, it's like it's the full duck, and it's like shiny and beautiful, like this like brownie red color. And the comment beside it was like, ew, gross. And I was like, what? And I was so mad. I'm like, double down and put more food and more descriptions, because I was very angry. But anyway, that's just an aside. But for me, food was about the relationship with the parents. She's preparing dumplings with her grandmother, like homemade dumplings, and with her father, just to show that there's rituals. And a lot of times love is expressed through food, feeding, making sure people are full. In Taiwanese and in Chinese, like you say, are you full? That's a greeting. Like you want to make sure people have eaten, because that means they're well. Also to show the different aspects of the characters, like Millie, who is the younger sister, she's a bit of a rebel. She likes to watch YouTube and make up her own recipes. She likes to like, she just goes her own way and adds a bit of this, a bit of that into recipes. But Holly Mae, she's very like, she likes rules and she'll never deviate from a recipe. So that shows that. And just different family rituals, like fluffy pancakes on Sunday that dad makes, or the big bowl of popcorn they share, but they always sprinkle it with sugar and salt, which we do as a family too. So just to show different family routines and how they all come together.
Yeah, it's
I love
funny.
that.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, Sylvia, jump in.
When you said that about family routines, it's funny because a lot of the food I include in my stories are food that we enjoy as a family. And so when my kids read the books, they're like, oh my gosh, you put too much of us, like they see too much of themselves in the books. But I also, like in Hannah's Shoe, there's a couple scenes around the dinner table. And so it is for me a way of connecting. And there's a part of the story where like she feels like she's getting disconnected from her family. So she remembers in the past when they had a lot more family dinners, and this is a rare thing now in the present of the book. So food is a good way to like not only convey the culture, but just convey how close or distant the family is to each other.
I use food in a few different ways. So I kind of used it for comedy as well as showing love. So the grandma loves fruit, but Danny doesn't like fruit, because I used to hate fruit when I was a kid, and I would only eat Granny Smith apples, the very green ones. So he's like that. He only eats green fruit. But she has a fruit bowl, everywhere there's a fruit bowl, because Chinese people generally love fruit, like oranges, they give oranges. And so she has fruit everywhere, and it's part of the plot because the original title for the book was actually Lychees and Bingo Balls, which was to do with the grandma, because she just loves lychees. And I just remember lots of older Chinese women and my English mom, because she would sometimes hang out with like Chinese women. They would have the lychees and like crack the shell open and then I just didn't like them, put the lychee in their mouth and spit the seeds out. And so that's in the book where like she spits the seeds out, and her aim is amazing. So I used it for comedy. And then I felt I needed to be quite careful, because there's a scene where she brings chicken feet to school, and Danny loves chicken feet, and I, the author, hate chicken feet. I don't like them. But I wanted to show that they're not gross, that lots of Asian people love them. And he's uncomfortable, not by the chicken feet, but by his grandma coming to school at lunchtime. So I needed to make that clear, because I didn't want to have any sort of, reader thinking, ooh, chicken feet are disgusting. I didn't want that, because I know how hard it is for Asian kids to take their lunch boxes to school and to like be proud of their food. So I had to be careful. And I think sometimes when I'm reading my mentees' work, so I have a couple of Vietnamese mentees, they talk about the stinky fish sauce, and they love this fish sauce from their culture. But I have to sort of sometimes say, just be careful how you're writing that, not for your readership that know about fish sauce, but for the readers that don't know fish sauce, that how you describe it is quite important to readers that don't know anything about your community. And so I think food's quite interesting in that way, in the world building, but also in how cultures are then seen, oh, your food's disgusting or this and that. So I think you have to be quite careful with it as well.
I used it kind of to show more divide and difference, instead of this like cozy, warm together love fest. It was more so my main character was raised on the continent and never really felt like she fit in Hawaii. And so when she goes grocery shopping and has to pick out, grandma sends her into the grocery store to get a bag of rice or to get some rice. She grabs the box, the orange box, and like gets ridiculed because that's not the white rice. Like, that's not the sticky rice. Why would you grab that box of rice? And it's just like, well, I didn't know. I've seen this at other friends' houses on the continent. Like, so I think it's easy to show her journey in not knowing what's good. And then she has another interaction with another character where she gets really guarded and unsure of if she's going to be ridiculed for not fitting in again. But the person brings up a restaurant that she's really familiar with, and she's able to say, oh, I love the haupia pancakes because they're massive and I can never finish the whole thing. And they have a bonding moment over this shared love for the local food at this restaurant. And so she's able to see a bit of a progression through food. And I didn't realize that until this panel. So that's kind of fun. But also Lihimoi gummy bears and treats are amazing. So those are in there too.
It reminds me of that scene in the Marvel movie where Captain America is like, I know that reference. And he's just like so proud of himself for like understanding a cultural reference after spending 70 years in the ice. Anyways, random MCU fan moment. But thank you. I want to go back to something that Maisie said a little bit about the fish sauce and like finding that balance between like representing the foods that you eat well, but also like not feeding into potentially like negative like stereotypes or stigmas that readers may come to the book with, and talk a little bit about world building and the white gaze and like world building specifically for AAPI writers. And so how much, if at all, when you're writing, do you feel like you have to kind of explain your world building for readers who might not be familiar with your story settings or the cultural elements of your world building? And how do you kind of navigate writing towards the white gaze or not writing towards it in your work? And Maisie, if you want to start us off with that.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question, because sometimes I've worked on commissions where I've had an editor who's not Asian have said, could you put more Asian stuff in? It was a short story and I was a bit put out. I was a bit like annoyed because it was about a birthday, actually, the story. And I was like, we just celebrate birthdays like everyone else. We have cake and candles. It's not a special East Asian birthday. So I think I put in a red envelope, that she got a red envelope, so you knew that the character was Chinese. And then I thought about Danny Chung, where I've put quite a lot of British Chinese world building in on purpose because I wanted myself. So I think it's my intention, not somebody else's intention, to share what I've learned and things that I know about British Chinese culture. But I think there was this kind of annoyance that someone else wanted me to put more in. But I think when it's from my own joy and experience, I feel that feels more authentic to me, and that's fine, rather than trying to shoehorn in certain cultural elements for someone else. So I don't really try and explain too much about certain cultural things. I'll just put it in. And I also think that because there's so many different types of Asian people, that we're mixed, that we're, you know, some are adopted, that sometimes we don't have some cultural things to put into our books. So my next book, Keep Dancing Lizzie Chu, doesn't have very much Chinese food in it at all. And actually her favorite meal is a British roast dinner. Because I think sometimes people expect us to put Chinese things in. And so sometimes I want to say, sometimes we're not traditional and sometimes we don't celebrate Chinese New Year or have these things. And so my next book is very different to Danny Chung in that respect, where I haven't put that much Chinese stuff in it, because the story is not really about that. It's about a young carer and a road trip. But I think with Danny Chung, I did want to, because in Britain, there aren't many books with British Chinese culture. It's kind of one of a handful. And so I did put things in on purpose, like the dim sum and taking your shoes off, and the lychees, because I wanted to show these are integral to British Chinese culture. But I think there is a thing of wanting to do it on my own terms. So we'll see.
Christina, what about you?
I guess starting back to the food and the story about me doubling down on the food. So I wanted I put a lot of food in, but I put descriptions and I made sure that everyone was enjoying the food, including the non-Asian people. I mean, the majority of people in this book are Asian or mixed. That's just the makeup of the high school. And that was my experience in upper school in Hong Kong. But so I wanted to make sure that it wasn't seen as sort of foreign. It was like everyday yummy food. And that's it just was there, like alongside the ham and cheese sandwiches that you have like bento boxes, and that's and the hargao alongside grilled cheese. So it was all just kind of normalized, if that makes sense. I also put in some Chinese idioms, and the main one that they use in the book is pronunciation is terrible, but it's like kujin ganlai, which is bitterness ends and sweetness begins. And I found when I was in Hong Kong and I was learning Chinese, you can understand a lot about the culture through the idioms. And so I wanted to put that in and just sort of give a flavor of the culture, but to also understand how much sort of history and Chinese culture permeates still modern day life. And that to show that even though Hong Kong is full of modern buildings and it's very concrete, but also there are beautiful country parks, and not just what people were expecting, like a Chinatown, like super exploded, like open air markets and with live chickens, because they do have that, but it's actually like a very modern city. It's like, you know, very good quality of life. And I wanted to show all of that, sort of dispel the exoticism of that. And I made a point of putting in a bit about the colonial past. Like I didn't want to touch on it too much. The book wasn't about that, but just to touch on, yes, it was a British colony. And yes, there are great things that came from that, but there are also, you know, parts of Hong Kong that Chinese people weren't allowed to live in until, you know, maybe 80 years ago, and they weren't allowed to mix. Intermarriage was frowned upon. So even though it's not a big part, it's touched on, and I want people to know that that really happened, and it's not sort of shoved under the rug, if that makes sense. And then I really wanted the women in the book, the three main women, which are like adult women, are Holly Mae's mom and her grandmother, and also Gemma's mom takes a role in there. They are not quiet and submissive. They are the bosses. Like Holly Mae's mom is the one who's a breadwinner, and they move with her to Hong Kong. And I thought that was important to show not only that the mom is the one with the fancy job, but also that she's Asian with the fancy job, and she's not just at home following her husband around, which unfortunately sometimes could be the stereotype.
Absolutely. Malia or Sylvia?
Go ahead, Maisie.
One of the first things I changed was actually a recommendation from Pitch War's mentor, who helped me. I eliminated a lot of the heavier dialect things that I had. The grandma speaks Pidgin, Tutu speaks Pidgin, and it was hard for readers to get into a cadence and a flow, especially if it's middle grade. So I did tone that down quite a bit in my story. Thank you, Sylvia, for that feedback. And then I did end up adding more Hawaiian language, actually, and just straight up Hawaiian words that I gave context clues. So they're not going to understand them, but I tried to work in more context. And then when describing places that folks might not be familiar with, like a lava tube, for example, I tried to make sure to use all of the different senses to give folks an idea of what they sound like and what they smell like and what it really feels like to be in a dark lava tube, though I guess you have caves, so that would work too. I purposely chose my main character, though she's Hapa, to be from the mainland because I wanted her to be ignorant of some of the cultural things. So I think from the white gaze or from the continent gaze, readers will still have an easy-ish time identifying with her because she does make these mistakes. Because otherwise no kid in Hawaii would ever disrespect the goddess that way. So I needed to have a reason to do that. But I also liked, oh, I forgot it, but I liked what Christina had said, and I can't remember what it is now. So go, Sylvia.
Yeah, I think what you said about context clues is sort of how I dealt with, like, I don't think I was actually thinking about the white gaze so much as, you know, throughout my whole story, I was thinking about the middle grade gaze, right? My readers are like 10, 11, 12, who may not be familiar with any part of, you know, the world I'm building. So, you know, even the sci-fi elements that were not Chinese, I had to give context clues because I have certain vocabulary, right? Like the kids get meshed. Well, what does that mean? But also with like the Chinese cultural stuff, I do like, I never explain it, but I give context clues. So for example, I have a situation where she wakes up and a friend of hers is making shifan, but then the next line I have the friend saying, and she said, waving her chopsticks that she just used, you know, to scoop the runny rice so that people can understand that that's what that was. So I think I kind of did that with most of the Chinese terms I used. So I also brought in a few like Spanish phrases because of the grandmothers, like telenovela watching. And in those cases, like one of them, I just literally translated, you know, because it was a long sentence. So I just, you know, wrote it in English.
I'm a big fan of context clues. And when it comes to my editing, that's usually how I like encourage my authors to kind of find that balance between writing for themselves and then writing for a potential white audience. Before we move on to the next question, though, I'm really curious, what does it mean when kids get meshed? Is that like you said that and I was like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that is like the premise where you get your brains connected to the internet.
Gotcha.
In that world, they get meshed to the multi-web. So
honestly, I don't know if being constantly connected to the internet is like my greatest dream or my greatest nightmare, like a little bit of both, honestly. So I'm very excited to read your book, Sylvia, and see how that works out. Okay, so I want to take it now a little bit back to craft and ask all of you, when it comes to world building, when you're sitting down, you're thinking of this new story that you're going to write, you're thinking about your world building, where do you start in terms of world building? Do you start kind of broader and then narrow in, or do you start really narrow, or just really kind of like take us through your world building process and what that looks like for you? Malia, do you want to start us off?
Sure. This for Lay, it was easy-ish for me because I could just picture where I was growing up. You know, it's a real place. I have very vivid memories of the sounds of the rain and the smell of the ginger and the bouncing on the guava trees and the feel of all the wet foliage against my jeans as I try to go through the rainforest. So I was able to see in my mind's eye kind of where this place was going to be. So I think getting started, I was focused more narrowly on the character and who she was going to be and where her grandma's house was going to be. It ended up just being my house. But the tricky part was I couldn't visualize her at all. And I don't know if other writers have that issue, but I was like, okay, she has brown hair and she has, you know, brown eyes, but I don't have a visual. And it wasn't until I saw my cover that I was like, oh, okay, cool. That's Lay. Great. Got it. So I had trouble with the minutia of world building, but the big picture was a lot easier since it is a real place that I could pull from.
When you said like the wet foliage slapping against the jeans, like that's so beautiful and visceral. Like I can feel that. I love that so much. Maisie, what about you?
For Danny Chung, it was quite easy because it's set in my hometown, and I wanted there to be kind of working class elements in my book because I grew up working class. My dad was a cleaner at the Cadbury's factory, the chocolate factory, and my mum used to be like a dinner lady at school and a foster carer. So we didn't have much money, and so the parents that his Chinese parents that work in a takeaway work really hard. And I start with the character, so it was Danny and his grandma were the first characters. And my English mum, Jean, she actually worked in a Chinese takeaway. It's a long story. She worked in a Chinese takeaway and I used to go and help there. So even though I didn't grow up in a Chinese takeaway, I knew one very well. And so that was the world where Danny lived in the book. But actually I created a fictionalized Birmingham because for the plot, I needed them to be away from Chinatown. So they're kind of 40 minutes away on the border. Because I wanted the mum to be a little bit isolated. I wanted Danny to maybe have a little bit of experience microaggressions. So I actually purposely moved the family because I think a lot of takeaway families are spread out. So I moved them to like the border of Birmingham for plot reasons. And my new book is set in Glasgow, which is where I live now. So I think I'm a little bit lazy and I'm just writing books where I live. And again, it's my local area with the parks and everything. But it's also got Blackpool in my new book, which I haven't been to since I was a kid. And so for the world building for that, it's a seaside town. It's a bit run down. I put a tweet out. Has anyone been to Blackpool recently? And a couple of writers actually sent me photos and videos and told me how it smelled. So they said it smelled like cigarettes and donuts. So I put that in the book because I thought, even though I can't go, that, you know, these two writers have told me that's what they can smell and see. So I'm very thankful to them to help me in that aspect of my world building. And I think because sometimes I write historical things, or I've done a few mythological stories as well. And for those, I'll try and go on the internet and look at pictures of, I did a story about Mulan, so I went and like did research on that. But for my contemporary novels, it was quite easy because I knew those locations very well.
I'm like very obsessed with all of these details, like a city that smells like cigarettes and donuts. Like you can smell that so immediately in your head. Like it's so wonderful and specific. Oh my gosh, that's such a great detail. Christina, what about you?
I have to say, I am in awe of people who can write fantasy because I can only write what I have personally experienced. So, you know, what I have in Hong Kong is I started in Hong Kong. I wanted to have a story that was set there. And then I just put in places that I knew, or if, you know, for book two, I made sure that like, if I wanted something included, I went to that place, you know, and sort of took notes. But I haven't tried to write a new, like a made up world or even a place that I haven't been. And I sort of rely on like, I start with the location and see what's going to happen. And then sort of from what's going to happen, I'll decide where it should happen or what location. And then I'll kind of close my eyes and think, okay, well, when I was there last, you know, what did I see? What did I smell? What did I touch? You know, what did I hear? And then I build it from there. So I'm definitely in awe of fantasy writers.
Yeah, like Maisie, I start with my characters when I world build, and I sort of put them in a situation, and then the things they interact with or the setting they're in sort of come to life. And I also set my futuristic world in my current town of Virginia Beach. So that way I could get some of the senses, you know, of like the salt, you know, salty sea air, or the beach nearby, that kind of thing. But because it's science fiction, the other thing I did that was kind of fun was my first draft, I would write these like basically like news articles about different parts of the world, like a new scientific, you know, experiment or whatever. and that were somewhat relevant to the plot. And my very first draft had those articles, like they were probably about a page long, starting in different like chapters and stuff. And I got feedback pretty quickly that that's going to distract readers. And so the final copy actually does still have those, but now they're like text size, so I basically had that info, but in 3 lines, in the front of some chapters, but it definitely helped like flesh out the world for me.
And I have to say, I love those headers. I'm so glad they're still in there. Good job.
Thanks.
They add a lot.
I feel like all of your answers have kind of led into my next question, which will probably be most relevant to Malia and Sylvia, but I think also have to do with, contemporary world building. Like Maisie said, you created like this fictionalized version of Birmingham, which I think is so great. So when you're writing your worlds, like how constrained do you feel by kind of what already exists in reality, or by your existing cultural or mythological details? Do you feel kind of hemmed in by that, or are you comfortable kind of making things up and just like taking your cultural elements and kind of expanding on them, or just adding in new things? Malia, if you want to start us off with that.
So this is kind of the biggest fear I had writing this book, is what other Native folks are going to think about me taking our legends and taking our Moolelo and making it my own. That's pretty terrifying, because they are such big pieces of culture. And in Hawaii, history and science, or history and legend, are the same word. Moolelo, it's the truth and its story all together, because there are families that are descendants of Pele, and I don't want to disrespect their ancestor. I don't want to do any damage to their lineage or anything like that, because my responsibility is to try share this stuff while holding it up in a way. So I tried to hold to the character's values and the character traits, while making it clear that this is a brand new story. This is not a retelling of a historical, cultural, like wonderful piece that I'm not going to touch that. This is brand new in today's world, and I'm reimagining these characters while hopefully holding true to their intrinsic selves. But I'm really curious what the reaction is going to be. Honestly, it's my biggest concern.
I think it's a challenge that I think a lot of marginalized authors have, because there are so few of these stories that exist, right? And so there's this sense that if you put this story out into the world, that it has to be everything for everybody. But there's no way that any story can be everything for everybody. And that's what I try to remember in the work that I'm doing. It's what I try to like make sure my authors remember, is that you can only do exactly what you're doing, which is put out a story that is respectful and that is celebratory and that represents like who you are as a writer. And I've read your book and I think it's wonderful, and I think that's exactly what you've done. So I have high hopes that the world will love it as well.
That's also really another reason why we need multiple voices, right? Because if you're the only Native Hawaiian book out there, you're only representing obviously your, experience. But if you had many more, then you can get the whole, like diverse experience. And I feel like, especially with all, like, we're a really good example. We have such different diaspora experiences, right? And even like the generation that your parents came out of, for example, China, makes a big difference in sort of the values that, you might have. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And like for my sci-fi, I actually felt pretty like free in like including Chinese like cultural elements, because first of all, I said it in the future. So I figure if I got it wrong, it's because it evolved, 30 years from now, people do this now. But my current work in progress that I'm doing is based on a Chinese fantasy. It's a Chinese fantasy based on a Chinese myth, and they're like Malia, I'm more like worried, but on the other hand, I feel like, well, a lot of like Western-based myth stories or authors, they don't feel constrained by that. Think of all the elf stories that live, out there. There are like 1,000 different elf worlds, so why can't, my, mythological creature be totally off from, the standard? So.
I agree, because my second book, Keep Dancing Lizzie Chu, has a girl that dresses up as the goddess Guan Yin, and she's like one of the biggest deities in Chinese and East Asian religion. So people actually pray to this goddess. So I was really nervous having this girl. It's part of the plot, but she dresses up as this goddess. And then throughout the novel, which is a contemporary novel, the grandfather tells these stories of Guan Yin because he prays to her and he loves her. But it did make me quite nervous about having her in. But then I was like, I did ask people. I asked lots of British Chinese people, do you think this is okay? And I think I do get nervous with each book I write. And even though I feel like I know takeaway culture because I kind of worked in one a little bit and my mum worked in one, I still had to ask other British Chinese people. It's like I didn't trust my own knowledge, even though that was my experience. I felt like I had to kind of go out and ask other people for not permission, but for validation or reinforcement. And I think writers of color, we do have that. We want to do better, we want to do better, and we're always anxious about getting it wrong, or these kind of things that I don't think a lot of other writers do have. So I can identify with what has been said here.
I think for me, because everything it's not made up, there are some fictionalized names, but because it's my experience and the experience of what I like my kids, and I was very worried, even though I had people in Hong Kong read it, expat, local Chinese and everything, but once it was out in the world, I was like holding my breath, and I'm like, are people in Hong Kong, are they going to appreciate what I've written? As I did call it my love letter to Hong Kong in the dedication, but what are they going to think of it? Are they going to be offended? Are they think I'm just way out there, or are they going to appreciate it? And I've had some lovely feedback from friends who are born and raised there, who are very fiercely proud Hong Kongers that I've done it well. So I'm like, but it was actually kind of nerve-wracking, and I didn't feel that way until it was about to come out. Actually, I wasn't nervous as I was writing it. It hadn't actually crossed my mind until I was like, uh-oh, it's going to go out, and luckily it seems to go down well.
I love that. I love that people have had such a positive reaction to your book, Christina. It's very well deserved, in my opinion, my completely unbiased opinion. So our last question, earlier Sylvia said something which I love, the phrase the middle grade gaze, which that's definitely going to be a part of my editor lexicon now, because I love that. So I want to go back and I want to talk about, in your world building, how do you think you approach like world building for middle grade stories specifically? So thinking about how kind of like YA authors or adult authors might approach their world building, and what is something that you do with your own writing and world building that you think is like very specific to creating these stories that are meant for like a very small subsect of readers? I mean, middle grade really is what, like for 8 to 12-year-olds, it's a very like small part of our lives. And so kind of, can you speak to kind of how you create worlds for these very specific age groups? Sylvia, if you want to start us off with the middle grade gaze.
I guess I've written, or I've started writing a YA, draft, but when I shared it around to people, they were like, this is a very young YA, it's almost middle grade. So I guess I have a middle grade voice when I write. But I think what it is I probably just like I guess I open up the inner characters on the inner world a little bit more. So I like sort of explain or almost tell feelings more, but also in the same sense, describing the world, I provide a little bit more explanation. So I guess, I like to think all of our readers are intelligent and smart. And so, my first drafts tend not to include all that, but then like my editors often say, oh, can you bring us in a little more to what she's feeling, like, because I almost like when I first write, I want the readers, oh, they can figure it out through context, what the character's feeling. But, for the younger, especially Manatee's best friend, which is geared a little bit younger, my editor was like, just have her show her feelings more, and explain things more.
Absolutely. Maisie, what about you?
So when I draft my books, I do think of kind of this imaginary reader that's 10 or 11. And when I was writing Danny Chung, my son was 8 at the time. And so I used to kind of listen to him, what he would say, what his concerns were, what he was like talking about when he talked about his friends from school. And so I kind of used little things like he used to like these Nerf guns. I don't know if you have those in the States, Nerf guns, but I don't call them that in the book. So I've got Nerf guns and scooters. So I kind of populate it with things I thought an 11-year-old boy would like. And then my second book is a kind of homage to popular culture. So there's kind of a Comic-Con chapter, there's Star Wars, and there's Star Trek and cosplay. And I know sometimes people tell you not to put certain brands in, like Marvel and things, because it might date, but I felt like Marvel and Star Wars had been around for such a long time that I could put those in. So I do think about that young reader that's 10 or 11 and what they might be interested in, and I like to sort of put those details in my book to try and let them feel that it's relevant to them, that they can relate to that child as well. So that's part of the world building of my books.
I love that you actually like took your 8-year-old son's like thoughts and like the
Yeah.
things that he liked and put that into the book. Like I feel often that there can be like such a disconnect between what the publishing world is like putting out and what young people actually want from their books. So the fact that you had this 8-year-old who you were listening to and allowing to kind of like inspire and influence you, like that's incredible, really.
Thank you. I just think that yeah, I agree with you that sometimes some middle grade books feel like they're written by adults.
Mhm.
And some of the feedback I've had is that Danny feels like a real boy, that some teachers have said, oh, it feels like a boy that's in my class. And so that's really nice to hear.
Yeah, that's an amazing compliment to get.
Yeah.
Malia, what about you?
For me, I've written YA and middle grade, and I think middle grade is fun, in my opinion, because my characters are still enjoying the bliss of kind of unknown, and their slate is cleaner just because they haven't had the life experience yet that comes with just those couple more years, that get you into being a full-blown teenager with not necessarily angst, but just more stuff going on, more there could be more scars, there could be more trauma, there could be more cynicism or jadedness in my YA characters than in my MG. MG are still more hopeful and more a little naive, I guess, in certain aspects. Also, I think what I see in some YA and adult is a lot more threads to follow than in middle grade. You can keep it not simpler necessarily, but cleaner, I guess. You can still go into all the full detail and vividness in those fewer threads that you're bringing to the YA reader, so that it's still super immersive and exciting and incredible and developed. But you don't need to follow all of these things all the time. I'm thinking of certain adult fantasy that even me, I'm like, wait, who is this person again? And I cannot remember by this chapter. So I really enjoy that. I think the goal for any age is to just provide that escape and transport your reader into another world or person. So no matter who I'm writing for, I still have that goal in mind, but I think the mental place is just different depending on who I'm writing or what age I'm writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that middle grade, just like you said, it's more streamlined in terms of its plot. It's just a little bit easier to follow. You don't get those like 5 POV epic fantasies where I literally have to like keep a list of all the characters. And absolutely. And Christina, what about you?
Like Malia said, like everything is seen as discovery and through innocent eyes, that they are very black and white. Everything is like good or bad, fair or not fair. And they're not yet learning, or they're just starting to learn about gray areas. So I need to keep that in mind. And I was lucky when I was writing Holly May that my kids were middle grade at that time. So I interviewed their friends and like what's going on at school and stuff. And then I even had my daughter read through the first draft, and she would like circle words. She's like, we would not use this word. This means something you don't know what it means. It's like when I put in the word thirsty dork, she's like, Mommy, thirsty doesn't mean what you think it means. And I was like, oh, just ambitious? She's like, no. I'm like, okay. She told me what it means now, and I crossed that out. So it's not in the book anymore. And some things that she's like, oh, don't put something about drama, and like, oh, are you still in a drama? And she's like, oh, Mommy, that's something an adult would say. I'm like, good, because that's what the adult is saying. And so it's showing that she doesn't understand you, so I'm going to leave it in. But yeah, so the kids are very unencumbered by kind of real world. They're starting to feel pressure from what's going around them. But it's not yet to the point where it's really affecting them deep down yet. So
I love that your daughter taught you the real meaning of thirsty. I'm never going to forget that. That's incredible. Oh my gosh. And now for kind of, I always like to, end panels asking everyone what they're reading, what books they're recommending, maybe specifically middle grade. I think you all might have grabbed some books. So yeah, whoever wants to start us off with, great middle grade recommendations, things that they're reading right now.
I'll go first. So this is Boy Everywhere, and it's by A.M. Dasu, and I know it's published in the States as well as UK, and it's about Sami, who's from Syria, and it follows his journey from Syria to Manchester in England, and it's just one of the best books about refugees that I've ever read. Like, the detail in it is so brilliant. And I know the author spent 5 years researching, talking to real refugees, but I really recommend this one. And also, I've started to read this, The Wonders We Seek, and it's about 30 incredible Muslims, and that's by Sadia Faruqi and Amnesia Mumtaz, illustrated by Safa Khan.
I can go. I actually am in the middle of Danny Chung, so I have the British one, and I didn't mention I live in Finland actually, and so we have a nice selection of the British books. So I didn't have the American one. I had the Danny Chung Does Not Do Maths, and I love how even though it takes place in Birmingham and he's a boy, I've actually found a lot in common with my upbringing and the Chinese way, with even my mom from Taiwan in Canada. So I thought it was, I'm really enjoying it, and there's some laugh out loud moments. And I just picked this up. I haven't yet started it. These Kids from Fawn Creek by Erin and Trada Kelly. And I'm a big fan of hers, especially in the way that she can bring in kids' ethnicities, but the books don't center around them. They just happen to be Filipino or Japanese. And it flows with the story, and the heritage is important to what the character is, but it's not, the story is not about their heritage. And I think that's really refreshing. So I'm a big fan of hers.
I just finished it and it made me cry. So you're gonna love it. It's very, very good.
This book, I haven't read it yet, but it's next on my to read list, Jennifer Chan is Not Alone, is by Tay Keller. Tay Keller was my mentor for Author Mentor Match, and I love When You Trap a Tiger, which was, the book that she won the Newbery for. And this one just sounds so interesting, about a girl who, sort of knows the rules of how to belong and, fit in. But then a girl named Jennifer Chen moves in across the street, and she, is her own person, is strange, is different. And then Jennifer Chan apparently disappears, and that sets off the story. So I'm really excited to read this one.
Well, that sets mine up perfectly because I haven't read this one yet, but I saw she was born and raised in Honolulu. So I was like, usually I'm not a literary reader. I apologize. I know that hurts the ears of so many authors, but I like fun commercial adventure-y things, but I'm going to give this one a shot because everybody talks about it. But right now I've been reading, I don't have the cover, sorry, but it's awesome. Hana Shu and the Ghost Crab Nation by Sylvia, and the world building is just incredible. You guys need to check it out. It's the first middle grade sci-fi I've read, and I'm blown away with how accessible she's made it to everybody, because I'm not a sci-fi person necessarily, but this is just fun and I can't wait to see what happens.
And then I have The Last Fallen Star and The Last Fallen Moon by Gracie Kim. The Last Fallen Moon is the second book in a trilogy. It's coming out in June, and it is just like an amazing Korean mythology inspired adventure from Rick Riordan Presents, and some of my favorite books that I've had the opportunity to work on at RRP. Yeah, they're great. Definitely very, very fun commercial reads. But I will say, When You Trap a Tiger, it is more literary, but as someone who also likes a more commercial read, like I loved When You Trap a Tiger. It's so emotional. It's so good. So Malia, I think you're gonna just love it.
I loved it too. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's so great. Well, that brings us to the end of our panel. I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing all of your incredible thoughts about world building with cultural elements in middle grade. I'm so excited to just read all of the books that you've recommended. My TBR now is just like, I mean, it's always out of control, but even more out of control now. And thank you so much for being here with me and with the Asian Author Alliance in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. And I hope you all go and have an amazing weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.